Hey everyone, welcome to the second part of our workshop on critical reading of college level texts. So just to give you an overview, you should have for practice number 1 selected steps 1 through 5, just one of these steps to do as a practice. And depending on whichever step you wanted to select, there are instructions below. I would like you to write your answer in a Google Docs form just to make sure the work is being saved, and then you can copy paste or upload that work into our discussion forum. Now moving on, we are ready for steps 6 to 10. Now what is step 6? Step 6 means, and this requires very clever critical reading, look for biases, hidden assumptions, or distinct values that the author sets forth. Now, I realized as I read more and more, and as my critical reading skills have gotten more advanced, that essentially everyone has bias. Everyone. Whatever article you read, there's no such thing as an unbiased article. Of course, I say that at the same time I realize that yes, there are a few people who are maybe in the middle of an issue and they can represent both sides, but most of the time they are going to be leaning towards one side or another. So what I mean by biases and assumptions and values is, really these things over here. In order to understand an author's bias, you might want to check their age, their sex, their education, their ethnic background. You might want to look at what, even just what political party they support, because sometimes that will indicate what sort of side they're taking in an issue. Sometimes these values are implicit, sometimes they aren't, and you have to look for them. So here's an example. I did not identify the author. This is coming from a famous speech from a person that in history that we all know. It says, this is part of the speech, "The whole world of nature is a mighty struggle between strength and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. There would be nothing but decay in the whole of nature if this were not so. States which should offend against the elementary law would fall into decay." Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody presented this paragraph to me, I would be like, that is totally Darwinian. It makes total sense. There it is. I believe in survival of the fittest. This is a smart person who's writing this. But it's important to know who the author is, where they come from, what they want. So, what if I told you that the author was, drumroll please, Adolf Hitler? So this is part of his speech that he made in Munich, April 13th, 1923. But basically, this is part of his rally call, before the Holocaust began, when he was already rising in power, he was gaining followers. And this speech was really about the supremacy of the German race and ultimately the need for the nation itself to defend itself, because the other side, the side that was weaker, was causing the main race to decay. That was the ultimate point. Now look, when you realize who the author was and what the author wanted, it does kind of change your perspective a little. So that's what I mean when I say look for biases, assumptions, values. It doesn't always have to be bad, but it's always good to recognize them, so then you can understand whether or not the author has a certain agenda. Step 7. Separate emotion from fact. Look, emotion is a good thing. We all have emotion, and of course we should have emotion, but when we are writing an argument, we want logic to dominate. So we want to put emotion aside sometimes and not be swayed by it. For example, a lot of abolitionists claim that the death penalty is wrong because of cruel and unusual punishment. And so here's an example of a man who suffered for hours on the electric chair before actually dying. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if I use this as an argument and I'm like, oh my God, look what happens to people, look how cruel this is. One thing that I'm not considering is, okay, how often does this happen? This happened in 1999. The occurrences are very rare. This was simply a malfunction in the electric chair. It's not really the norm. So it's not something that typically happens. So you got to consider that as well. Also, when I use an argument like this, what I'm trying to do is shock my readers. I want them to be shocked. I want them to be horrified. And because I'm working on that negative emotion, I end up taking away from the logic of the argument. I take away from the victim. I take away from the crime. I kind of mislead my audience. I don't allow them to realize what this man did. Which, by the way, was break into a home with a pregnant woman and her kids and murder all of them. So sometimes, logic is, I'm sorry, sometimes pathos, emotion is important, but not at the expense of logic. And that's why in a piece of writing, it's very important to understand, that the logic should be dominating and be able as a critical reader to separate the two so that you don't get carried away by your emotions. And then of course your logic just, gets thrown out the window. Step 8. If something's unfamiliar to you in terms of facts or references, allusions, look it up. Sometimes, it's very simple. When you have your smartphone at your disposal, it's so easy to just be like, hey Siri, find this out for me. And then of course there's Siri who does the research for you. I didn't have that when I was growing up and when I was in high school. I didn't even have that in college. So it was incredibly hard because I would have to, literally log into my computer and look up things. But now you guys can just research so easily. So anytime something's unfamiliar to you, why not look it up? Inform yourself. So I thought I would give you an example from Pride and Prejudice. There's a woman who has 5 daughters, and of course this is happening, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this mom who has 5 daughters gets excited when there's a single man, Mr. Bingley, who has a large fortune, and she says, "Oh, he has 4,000 to 5,000 pounds a year. What a fine thing for our girls." Now, when I was reading that, I was thinking, 4,000 to 5,000 pounds a year? I don't understand what that means or if that's a lot of money. So I looked it up. So first of all, here's the research that I found. We live in the 21st century, and this is a 19th century novel, and this is happening in England, which is why they're referring to pounds and not dollars. So that's something to consider as well, that the money is going to obviously be different in the 19th century versus the 21st century. Secondly, at that time, 4,000 to 5,000 put this guy at the top 1%. So, keep in mind that was considered a lot of money at that time. So just to translate, and again, I used the internet to discover this, today that would be about, 688,000 pounds, or if you want to translate that to dollars, $866,000. Now, again, that's a lot. That's almost $1 million that we're talking. So the point is, Mr. Bingley was, of course, rich, and of course, this mom, Mrs. Bennet, had every right to be excited for her daughters, because if he did want to marry one of them, they would be marrying a rich guy. Yay! Step 9. Evaluate whatever evidence is given to you. Now look, when we turn on the TV, we're going to come across so many different types of evidence, but a lot of times when we're watching the news or something, the news doesn't give us sources. Or even if we're like, looking at things online, like it's on Facebook or it's on Twitter, and suddenly there's a fact, there's a percentage of unemployment in this region. Well, where is that evidence coming from? We should always ask ourselves that question. So my advice is to be a strong critical reader. Verify a questionable opinion by cross-checking with other sources. Of course, you want to check the date, you want to check the source. Be skeptical of anything that is coming from, a source that is like, doctors say. Well, okay, what doctors? From what institution? When was the study conducted? There's so much information that you will need to know to actually believe this evidence. And I thought I would give you the example of hydroxychloroquine, which was very controversial, and it still is. And the example is basically, can this drug combat COVID-19? So when you look up the drug, what you realize is, okay, this is considered an immunosuppressive drug, and it's mainly used for malaria and sometimes for arthritis and lupus. Now, the debate is whether this drug is helpful for the coronavirus. And here are the findings. And I just wasn't sure, I was like, I don't know what to believe. So let's look it up. There are some patients who actually claim that the drug helped them recover faster, but that it helped them in the early parts of their diagnosis. But then at the same time, there's no medical data that says that this is a cure. So there's no such thing as taking the drug and being like, oh, it's going to cure it. It's going to completely get rid of coronavirus. So the point is that we do need to do more studies to reach a conclusion. And the FDA has not yet approved it, but there are some promising findings that suggest that the drug can be helpful in the beginning stages of the coronavirus diagnosis. So I wanted to give that as an example because, again, you have to evaluate the evidence first, which requires maybe further research. Finally, step 10, recognize logical fallacies. Now, logical fallacies are logical errors in writing and in speech. And your job is to be able to recognize them and maybe even to question them. By the way, politics is full of logical fallacies. I wanted to give you 2 examples. Here's one. Now, who's Candace Owens? She's a Black conservative commentator, political activist, and she was basically arguing that Black Americans should not martyrize George Floyd. This was a very controversial argument she was making. And then in his comedy segment, Dave Chappelle, and I don't think I need to introduce him, but here's an intro of him. He said, and I quote, "She's the worst." He's talking about Candace Owens. "I can't think of a worse way to make money. She's the most articulate idiot I've ever seen in my effing life." And this is an example of an ad hominem. This is when you attack the person instead of their argument. So for example, him calling her an idiot is him attacking her personally instead of attacking her argument. So he's ignoring the argument and attacking the person. Here's another example. This is Donald Trump's tweet on June 11th. He tweeted, "The radical left Democrats, first they try to take away your guns, then they try to take away your police. This is a straw man, and it's also a scare tactic when you try to make the opposite side afraid, or you argue against a side that they never actually claimed." For example, the radical left Democrats, not all of them are supporting the whole defunding the police. So I wanted to give you guys 2 examples of different fallacies, just so you could see, actual live examples of them. Now, finally, our second practice is to choose one of these steps, and depending on which one you choose, here are some instructions below. Go back to your Google Docs page and do the practice. There's a total of 2 practices that you will be posting, and that will complete this workshop.